You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first underwater trail. It's called the Emerald Bay State Park Maritime Heritage Trail, and it includes 4 different sites showcasing sunken historic boats.
They did not find a monster at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. What they found was worse, because it was real, because it was ours, and because it had been sitting for years beneath some of the clearest water in America, while millions of people stood on the shore believing they were looking at purity. Lake Tahoe has always inspired the kind of language people usually reserve for myth. Mark Twain, writing in Roughing It, called it the fairest picture the whole earth affords. That sentence still follows the lake everywhere, across postcards, tourism campaigns, drone reels, and real estate brochures. And to be fair, the line survives for a reason. Tahoe really can look impossible, a blue so cold it feels metallic, granite slopes dropping toward water so transparent that distance itself seems to hesitate. The danger of a place like that is not only that people fall in love with it. The deeper danger is that they begin to trust beauty as evidence. That trust is part of what makes the story of falling water so unnerving. When lake levels drop, even modestly, the shoreline changes character. Beaches widen. Old pilings, half-buried metal, lost docks, and forgotten debris begin to announce themselves. The lake stops looking eternal and starts looking historical. It reveals that beneath the seasonal sparkle is a record of everything people built, lost, discarded, and chose not to think about again. For years, local cleanup divers have said that low water doesn't create the problem. It simply removes the cover story. The most visible proof has come from the people who have spent more time under Tahoe's surface than almost anyone else, the divers of Clean Up the Lake. Founded by Colin West, the non-profit began documenting and removing submerged trash from the shoreline and nearshore zones, then expanded into a lake-wide effort that became one of the most revealing environmental projects in Tahoe's recent history. Their 72-mile cleanup, carried out with volunteers, removed 25,281 pounds of submerged litter from the lake. Not rumor. Not folklore. Not one dramatic artifact posed for a thumbnail. 25,281 pounds of evidence. And the evidence was not glamorous. That is what makes it terrifying. Catastrophe in real life rarely arrives with perfect symbolism. It comes as bottles, tires, fishing line, sunglasses, plastic fragments, metal scraps, and the quiet, ugly endurance of things designed to be forgotten. In reporting on the cleanup, Voice of America noted that divers recovered bottles, tires, fishing gear, engine blocks, lampposts, even no littering signs from the lake. Think about that detail for a moment. A no littering sign lying underwater among the litter is not just irony. It is a summary of modern environmental failure in a single image. What the divers described was not one isolated dump site or one scandal that could be blamed on a single bad actor. It was the cumulative signature of ordinary use. Tahoe receives immense pressure from recreation, boating, shoreline development, road traffic, storms, tourism, and simple human carelessness. Colin West has been blunt about that reality. Much of what his team has pulled up, he has said, reflects the impact of recreating, living, and building a community in the Tahoe Basin. In other words, the threat did not come from some alien force entering paradise. It came from the normal habits of people who loved the place while slowly burdening it. That is why the title of this story matters. As water levels dropped, divers found something terrifying. But the terrifying thing was not hiding there because the lake had suddenly changed. It was hiding there because our point of view changed. Lower water exposed the edges. Divers exposed the shallows. Data exposed the pattern. The horror was never an underwater jump scare. It was the dawning recognition that the clearest water in the country could hold a long, patient archive of neglect without losing its beautiful face. To understand why that contradiction feels so unsettling, you have to understand Tahoe itself. Official Tahoe science sources describe a lake of rare scale and unusual sensitivity. The UC Davis Tahoe Environmental Research Center lists Lake Tahoe's maximum depth at 1,645 feet, making it one of the deepest lakes in the world and the second deepest in the United States. California State Parks describes it as more than 22 miles long and 12 miles wide, and generations of visitors have measured its magic by how far the eye can travel below the surface. For decades, clarity readings have become one of the lake's most famous health indicators, tracked by UC Davis researchers since 1968 using a Secchi disc lowered into the water. Those measurements tell a story that is easy to miss if you only visit Tahoe for a weekend. In June 2026, UC Davis reported that annual average clarity in 2025 was 69.2 feet. Better than the previous year, yes, but still far from the historic benchmark of 97.4 feet recorded between 1967 and 1971. Stephanie Hampton, director of TERC, warned against celebrating too quickly, saying the lake's clarity has not substantially improved for decades. That matters, because clarity in Tahoe is not just a pretty statistic. It is a moral barometer. When the water grows less transparent, it is the lake registering the cost of everything happening around it. And yet clarity can also mislead. Clear water creates a psychological permission structure. It persuades casual observers that what cannot be seen probably does not exist. Tahoe's great visual gift becomes, in that sense, part of its vulnerability. If trash sinks below the range of a swimmer's eye, if contamination disperses gradually, if older debris settles into darker water, the lake can continue to look healthy even while absorbing insult after insult. Beauty delays urgency. It lets a problem age beneath admiration. This is not entirely new. Tahoe's environmental history has long been tied to the consequences of post-war growth. UC Davis notes that its early clarity findings became central to efforts to protect the watershed from pollution and unplanned development. The Tahoe Regional Planning Agency itself emerged from that era of alarm. Scientists, planners, and residents had already learned by the late 20th century that a lake can seem vast and resilient while still being damaged by sediment, nutrients, and careless building practices. The divers simply brought that lesson into a new register. They gave the problem shape, weight, texture, GPS coordinates. There is another reason the underwater discoveries land so hard. They puncture the seductive mythology of what lies beneath Tahoe. For generations, stories about Tahoe Tessie, lost treasure, mob secrets, and mysterious depths have circulated around the basin. Those legends thrive because a deep lake naturally invites projection. Humans hate a blank space. We fill it with serpents, gangsters, and whispers. But as Voice of America put it in its report on the cleanup, divers found no trace of a mythical monster and no sign of mobsters in concrete shoes. Instead, they found what may be more disturbing than folklore, proof that the everyday behavior of ordinary society can degrade an extraordinary landscape more effectively than any legend ever could. Even Tahoe's officially celebrated wrecks tell part of that story. California State Parks opened the Emerald Bay Maritime Heritage Trail to showcase historic watercraft and barges resting below the surface. It is a remarkable project, and an honest one. The underwater trail acknowledges that human history in Tahoe does not sit beside the lake. It sits in it. Boats, barges, launches, and working relics remain below the waterline as part of the basin's cultural memory. In the protected setting of a heritage trail, those objects can feel romantic, almost tender. But the divers cleaning the larger lake were dealing with a harsher version of the same truth. What enters Tahoe does not simply disappear. The lake keeps receipts. And now the cleanup work is moving deeper. Clean Up the Lake's newer project pages describe monitoring and litter removal at depths well beyond the easy nearshore zone, with surveys in the 45 to 75-foot range and a future heavy lift removal plan targeting 722 larger submerged items from the lakebed. That number should make you stop. 722 heavy items serious enough to require special planning, specialized recovery, and more money than a shoreline volunteer day can solve. It suggests that the visible trash problem was only the first layer, and that the lake has been storing a much bulkier inheritance below. What kinds of things become heavy lift litter in a place like Tahoe? Construction debris, illegal buoy gear, metal fragments, larger equipment, long abandoned material too awkward, too expensive, or too inconvenient to remove when it first entered the water. In shallow conversation, pollution is often imagined as small and repetitive, the bottle cap, the straw, the wrapper. But underwater, neglect acquires mass. It hardens. It rusts. It anchors itself to the landscape until removal becomes a technical operation instead of a simple act of responsibility. That is the emotional center of this story. Not the fantasy that divers uncovered one cinematic horror, but the quieter realization that they uncovered a system. A lake famous for clarity had become, in places, a storage space for consequences. The contrast is what lingers. Above the surface, wedding photos, ski weekends, marinas, vacation homes, sunlight on blue water. Below the surface, line, rubber, metal, broken objects, and years of human afterthought collecting in silence. The same economy that depends on Tahoe's beauty also produces pressure on the very conditions that make the beauty possible. If you want the most haunting detail, it may be this. The divers did not just remove trash, they categorized it. Researchers and volunteers logged what they found, where they found it, and what type of material it was. That choice transformed the cleanup from a feel-good exercise into something closer to testimony. Once mapped and measured, litter stops being anecdotal. It becomes forensic. It can be compared over time. It can point toward likely sources. It can show which behaviors are episodic and which are structural. In that sense, every bottle and scrap of fishing gear became part of a larger argument that Tahoe's problems are not invisible because they are minor. They are invisible because invisibility has been one of the lake's defining illusions. There is something almost tragic in how long it took for this to become obvious. UC Davis has measured Tahoe's health indicators for decades. Scientists have warned about clarity, runoff, fine particles, and ecological stress for decades. Conservation groups have defended the basin for decades. And still, one of the most arresting public images to emerge in recent years was not a chart, not a regulatory meeting, not a policy memo, but divers surfacing with the literal remains of what visitors and residents had left behind. Sometimes a society will ignore a trend line until someone drags the trend onto the dock. Before the viral thumbnails and dramatic narrations, there was a quieter truth that scientists and residents had been wrestling with for a long time. Tahoe is famous not only because it is beautiful, but because it is unusually legible. Small changes in clarity, runoff, and shoreline condition become meaningful here faster than they do in murkier places. That is why early lake research mattered so much. Once the lake began losing some of the deep transparency people thought was natural and permanent, it became harder to pretend development carried no cost. The water was telling on the basin. The irony is that Tahoe's scale encourages denial even while its sensitivity punishes it. A lake this large feels indestructible to the casual visitor. It looks like weather carved it and weather alone could ever threaten it. But the history of the basin says otherwise. Voice of America's report on the cleanup traces Tahoe's transformation through westward expansion, timber extraction, elite estates, casinos, and decades of increasingly intense recreation. By the time modern environmental concern caught up, the lake had already absorbed generations of runoff, shoreline disturbance, and submerged debris. The image of Tahoe as untouched wilderness was always, at least partly, a curated memory. That deeper history matters because the trash below the surface did not arrive all at once. It accumulated the way cultural damage usually does, incrementally, casually, with no single day dramatic enough to force a reckoning. A bottle slides from a boat. A fishing lure snaps off and vanishes. A dock component breaks loose in winter. Construction material enters the water during shoreline work. Storms move neglected objects farther out. A tourist drops sunglasses. A resident loses equipment and decides it is not worth recovering. None of these moments feels historic on its own. Together, over years, they become an underwater landscape. And once that landscape forms, it does not remain inert. Scientists involved in Tahoe cleanup and research have emphasized that submerged litter is not merely ugly. It changes chemically and physically over time. Plastics fragment. Rubber degrades. Metals corrode. Fishing line entangles wildlife. Hard debris alters habitat. In the VOA report, Biochemist Zoe Harold warned that if submerged litter is left in place, particularly plastic and rubber, it will continue to release microplastics and leachates into Tahoe's water. That sentence should be read slowly. The danger is not only what we can photograph on the lake bed. The danger is what those objects become as they break apart into forms too small to notice and too persistent to easily remove. That helps explain why cleanup divers often describe their work with a strange mix of optimism and grief. On one hand, every recovered object is tangible progress. Every tire or engine part pulled from the water is one less future source of breakdown and contamination. On the other hand, the work is emotionally punishing precisely because the lake looks so pure from above. Divers move through a split reality. They surface into postcard light after spending hours in a hidden layer of human disregard. Most people who enjoy Tahoe never have to experience that split. The cleanup teams do, again and again. Their finds are valuable not because they are rare, but because they are representative. A diamond ring recovered from the lake may make for a colorful interview. A lamppost or engine block grabs attention. But the real story lives in repetition. The same categories appearing over and over, the same pattern of use and abandonment, the same evidence that ordinary recreation without stewardship slowly writes itself into the basin. The treasures are not the objects. The treasure is the clarity of the pattern they reveal. Even the numbers carry a moral force. 189 dives. 25,281 pounds removed. More than 100 volunteers. Hundreds of heavy items still requiring planned recovery. Those figures challenge a comforting fantasy many people carry about environmental harm. The fantasy that the problem is exaggerated, or confined to a few bad weekends, or caused by someone else entirely. Numbers do not allow that escape. They show scale. And scale is where denial begins to fail. Low water intensifies that failure because it collapses distance. Items once hidden just beyond sight become visible from land. The shoreline becomes evidence. A person who would never watch a scientific presentation may still understand the sight of exposed debris where clean water is supposed to be. That is one reason dry periods change public perception so quickly. They turn abstraction into encounter. The lake no longer seems to be keeping its secrets far below. It appears to be handing them back. For me, that is the most haunting image in the whole Tahoe story. Not divers descending into darkness, but the lake itself becoming less able to conceal what has been done to it. As if the waterline were not just falling, but losing patience. As if the basin were reaching the point every damaged place eventually reaches, the point where beauty can no longer fully absorb the narrative written into it. Tahoe is still blue, still immense, still worthy of reverence. But now, when you hear Twain's old sentence about the fairest picture on earth, another question lingers beside it. Fair to whom? Fair for how long? And what, exactly, has the picture been asking us not to notice? None of this means Tahoe is ruined. Saying that would be too easy, and it would also be false. The lake is still astonishing. It is still ecologically important. It still deserves awe. But awe without accountability is exactly how a place like Tahoe gets wounded. The real lesson of the dropped waterline is not that the lake suddenly became frightening. The lesson is that fear arrived when the scenery stopped protecting us from the truth. Beauty had been performing a kind of silence. Then the shoreline moved, the divers went down, and the silence broke. That is why this story unsettles people far beyond the Sierra Nevada. Lake Tahoe feels iconic, almost untouchable in the American imagination. If a place so celebrated, so watched, so photographed, and so loved can accumulate that much submerged damage, then the question begins to spread outward. What is resting beneath other lakes whose surfaces still glitter? What have we mistaken for health simply because it remained photogenic? What damage have we agreed not to see, as long as the water from a distance still looks blue? In the end, the most terrifying thing found in Lake Tahoe was not a beast, a body, or a cursed relic. It was a mirror. It showed what happens when human beings mistake scenery for immunity, when they inherit wonder and treat it like storage, when they trust a clear surface more than they trust the warnings of science, cleanup crews, and time. Water levels dropped, divers looked harder, and the lake answered with the most troubling reply it could give. Not that something monstrous had entered it, but that ordinary neglect had been there all along, waiting patiently beneath the image we preferred to believe.